barks I found in Jack's workshop was small, cedar with brass corners, and heavy enough to hold something more than screws. It would eventually put his sister behind bars for wire fraud and give me back the boat she stole, the boat she sold out from under me for $95,000 while I was still sleeping in the guest room above her boathouse. But first I had to sit in her kitchen with a cup of cold tea, pretend to be a grieving widow too foggy to read a single page of a loan contract, and wait for the right moment to pick the lock on her filing cabinet. I had to smile while her husband Mark explained that I was a liability now, a woman alone with no head for business, and that they were doing me a favor by taking over my life. I'd end up owning their lakefront cottage, running sunset cruises from the dock where she once parked her Lexus, under a banner that reads "The Truth Floats." But nobody saw it coming, least of all Diane, because the quiet ones, the ones who know how to wait, we are the most dangerous. My name is Claire. I'm 47 years old, and before any of this happened, I spent 23 years as an ICU nurse. That career taught me two things that would matter later: how to read vitals on a monitor and how to read people when they are lying. The way the pulse jumps in the throat, the way the pupils dilate a fraction, the way a person who is about to steal from you will pat your hand a little too softly. Jack, my husband, was a master boatwright. He could look at a splintered plank of Honduran mahogany and see a hull that would last a century. We met at a boat show in Annapolis, me in my late 30s, him in his early 50s, both of us too old for games. We married on the deck of a restored 1948 Shepherd runabout, the water flat and silver behind us. No children, just a clapboard house on the river and a shared obsession with vintage watercraft. The centerpiece of that obsession was a 1956 Chris Craft Capri, 21 feet of gleaming mahogany and chrome, a boat Jack had spent 4 years restoring from a rotting shell he found behind a barn in Maryland. We named her Christina M. after his mother. She was appraised at $80,000, insured for more, and every Saturday we'd take her out, the engine a low throaty rumble, the wake crisp as a starched sheet. Jack's sister Diane was the family's golden child, a woman whose charm twinkled like polished brass, while her own finances were a slow leak below the waterline. She'd float from one scheme to the next, a catering business that failed, a boutique that never opened, always rescued by their parents or later by Mark, the smooth-faced real estate broker she married. Jack never trusted her with a dollar. He'd say, "She's got champagne taste and a tap water budget, and she'll drill a hole in your hull to get it." But he loved her, or he loved the idea of her, the little sister he'd protected as a kid. I hadn't thought much about any of that until the morning in September when I found him collapsed in the boathouse. An aneurysm, the doctor said, a weakness in the vessel wall that had been there for years, silent, waiting. The coffee in his mug was still warm. I'll spare you the grief because that isn't what this story is about. What matters is that within 48 hours of the funeral, the vultures landed. Diane and Mark appeared on my front porch with a casserole in a Pyrex dish and a leather folio tucked under Mark's arm. Mark wore a navy blazer with brass buttons, his hair the color of wet sand and shellacked into a wave. He treated his own reflection like a client he was trying to sell a house. Diane's hug was too tight, her perfume a cloud of gardenias that clung to my clothes long after she let go. They breezed through the house, their condolences as hollow as a fiberglass hull knocking against a dock. "Poor Jack," Diane said, her voice cracking on cue. "We're here for you now, Claire, your family." She said family the way a fisherman says chum. By noon the next day they were in Jack's workshop, sorting through his tools, assessing value. I stood in the doorway, still numb, still wearing the black dress I'd worn to the service. Diane lifted a small wooden box from the top shelf of his workbench. It was about the size of a shoebox, cedar with oxidized brass corners, a cheap lock on the front, the kind you'd put on a diary. She shook it. Whatever was inside gave a soft metallic rattle, like a handful of cotter pins. "Old screws and junk," she said, and dropped it into a cardboard box destined for the thrift store along with his paint-splattered radio and a set of dulled chisels. Mark said, "We'll clear all this out so you don't have to deal with it, Claire. You need to rest." I nodded and said nothing. I watched her toss that box like it was nothing, and something cold settled in my chest, a needle of clarity through the fog. That evening, after they'd gone back to their own house on the lake, a sprawling cottage with a wraparound porch and a private dock, I walked to the donation pile in the garage. The box was still there, half buried under a coil of old dark line. I carried it inside to the kitchen and set it under the light. The lock was a simple wafer design, 3 tumblers at most, the kind you could bypass with a paperclip if you knew the trick. Jack had taught me that trick on a rainy afternoon years ago when he'd locked himself out of his tackle box, and I'd laughed at him, a master woodworker undone by a 2-inch piece of brass. He'd shown me how to make a tension wrench from a hairpin, how to rake the wafers gently with a bent paperclip until they aligned. I went to the bathroom, pulled a bobby pin from my hair, and bent it with a pair of needle-nose pliers from the junk drawer. I slid the short end of the tension wrench into the keyway, applied light clockwise pressure, and used the rake end of the paperclip to scrub the wafers. 1 click, 2, 3. The plug turned and the lid popped open with a faint creak. Inside was not screws. There was a bundle of yellowed photographs, Jack and his father on a fishing boat, Jack and me on our wedding day, my face young and sunburned, laughing. There was a tarnished brass key with a numbered tag that read First Marine Bank 187. And there was a small black moleskine notebook, the cover worn soft at the corners. I opened it. The first pages were sketches of boats, measurements for planking, notes on varnish mixes, the careful hand of a craftsman. I flipped to the back and my breath stopped. The last entry was dated 3 weeks before Jack died. The handwriting was his, but shakier than usual, as if he'd been tired or in pain. It read, "Claire, if you're reading this after I'm gone, do not trust Diane. She will try to take everything. She's been circling for years, and I couldn't stop her without causing a rift that would hurt you. Save yourself. The key is to safe deposit box 187 at First Marine Bank on Bay Street. There's a letter there that explains everything I've put in place. Forgive me for keeping it from you. I love you. Fair winds." I stared at the page until the letters blurred and I had to set the notebook down because my hands were shaking. Then I folded it into the pocket of my cardigan, palmed the key, and slid the box behind a loose baseboard in the back of my closet. I knew then that whatever plan Diane and Mark had, it had already started, maybe even before Jack's body was cold. So before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that the quietest people are often the ones you should watch the closest, because that's the lesson I was about to learn with compound interest. Alright, back to the story. The next day, Diane and Mark arrived with a plan wrapped in concern. They sat me down at my own kitchen table, a fresh pot of coffee steaming between us, the morning light catching the dust motes that had settled on everything since Jack died. Diane wore a camel-colored cardigan and pearls, the costume of a woman who wanted to look trustworthy. Mark opened his folio and spread documents across the oak. "We want to help you, Claire," Diane said, patting my hand. "You're in no condition to manage Jack's affairs. We'll set up a restoration business, the two of us 50-50. It's what Jack would have wanted. We'll use the Chris-Craft as collateral for a small business loan, just to get the shop up and running. You won't have to worry about paperwork." Her wedding ring, a cushion-cut diamond, caught the light and threw tiny rainbows onto the wall. Mark slid a stack of papers toward me. There were formation documents for an LLC, a commercial loan application from Florida Marine Credit Union for $150,000, and a power of attorney naming Diane as my agent with full authority to sign on my behalf. "Just sign here for now," she said, pointing with a manicured nail, "so we can get started. Once you're feeling better, we'll go over the details." I watched the way her thumb tapped the tabletop, a restless rhythm. I remembered how a patient's heart rate would spike on the monitor just before they asked for more pain medication than they needed. I remembered Jack's warning. So I did the only thing that made sense. I played weak. I let my gaze drift, let my voice go soft and slow like I'd just woken from a nap. I can't think straight right now. My head's all foggy. I keep losing track of sentences. Can I look at this tomorrow? Diane's smile tightened at the corners, the way a suture pulls when there's tension beneath the skin. "Of course, sweetie, take your time, but you know time is money in business. We want to get that shop open before spring." They left the documents on the table, a trap set in plain sight. 2 days later, Diane called with a new offer, her voice honeyed and urgent. "Come stay with us at the cottage just for a few weeks. You shouldn't be alone in that big house with all those memories. We've got the guest suite above the boathouse. It's sunny, you'll love it. And we can keep an eye on you, make sure you're eating." What she meant was they could control the environment, they could control me. I agreed because being inside their home would give me access I couldn't get from a distance. I packed a single suitcase. In it, among my clothes, I hid Jack's notebook, the safe deposit key, and the old lockpick set he'd given me years ago, a worn leather case with tension wrenches, hooks and rakes, the tools of a trade he'd learned one summer as a locksmith's apprentice before he discovered boats. I also packed my nursing kit, the one with the blood pressure cuff, stethoscope, and a small zippered pouch of hemostats and scissors. It was the perfect cover. Nobody questions a middle-aged woman carrying medical supplies. The cottage was everything you'd expect from a real estate broker with a taste for appearances and a line of credit he couldn't afford. 4 bedrooms, wide plank floors, a stone fireplace that had never seen a real fire, and a boathouse big enough for a 40-foot cruiser. My guest suite was above the boathouse, accessible by an exterior staircase, with a deadbolt on the door that I noticed locked from the outside as well as the inside. That was a detail that kept me awake the first night. I lay in the bed, listening to the water lapping against the pilings below, and I catalogued every item in the room. The window that looked out over the lake, the closet with folding doors, the smoke detector on the ceiling with a tiny blinking red light. I wondered if it was a camera. I wondered how far they were willing to go. I unpacked my nursing kit on the dresser, the blood pressure cuff and stethoscope in plain view, and I practiced my fragile widow act in the mirror. A slight tremor in the hands, a tendency to lose my train of thought mid-sentence, a grateful smile for every cup of tea Diane brought me. For the next week I shuffled around in slippers, claimed I couldn't sleep, acted confused whenever Mark mentioned the paperwork. Diane would slide documents across the breakfast bar, and I'd pick up the pen, then set it down with a sigh. Maybe tomorrow, I'm just so tired. The doctor said it's normal with grief, the brain gets foggy. They'd exchange glances, the kind that married couples do when they are silently agreeing to be patient for just a little longer. They brought me chamomile tea in the evenings and asked if I'd remembered to eat. They thought I was broken. Instead, I was watching. I was studying the rhythm of their days. Mark left for showings at 9:15. Diane had a tennis lesson on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 10. The cleaning service came on Wednesdays at noon. I noted which doors were locked and when, which phones rang and were answered in hushed tones on the deck, which papers were shredded, and when the recycling truck came to take them away. The first red flag came on a Tuesday morning. Mark's cell phone rang while he was making coffee, the machine beeping and hissing on the counter. He glanced at the screen, a number labeled Regional Lender F. McCoo, and his face turned the color of spoiled milk, a sudden pallor I recognized from patients going into shock. He stepped outside onto the deck, sliding the door shut, but the glass was thin and my hearing, after years of listening for ventilator alarms, was sharp. I crept to the door, cracked it an inch and heard fragments. Need an extension, we're looking at 30 days minimum. The collateral is solid, a 1956 Capri appraised at 80, it's more than enough. Yes, she's here, she'll sign within the week, I have her power of attorney right here. No, we can't rush her, she's still grieving, you know how it is. His voice was frantic, a thin wire of panic beneath the smooth broker's tone. When he came back inside, his smile was back in place, but the muscle in his jaw was twitching like a trapped nerve. I filed that away. There was a loan already in process, maybe already advanced, and my signature was the only thing standing between them and a default. A few days later, on a Wednesday when the cleaning service was there, and the house was full of the sound of vacuum cleaners, I noticed Diane in the home office, a room that was always locked when I walked by unless someone was inside. I was passing through the hallway with a cup of tea when I saw the door ajar. Through the gap, I watched her feeding a thick stack of papers into a cross-cut shredder. She'd glance over her shoulder with each sheet, her movements quick and furtive. The machine whirred and chewed, turning documents into confetti. After she left, locking the door behind her, I waited until the cleaning crew moved to the upstairs bedrooms. Then I slipped into the hallway and knelt by the recycling bin under the shredder. The bin was a grey plastic tub, almost empty except for a few stray shreds that had missed the bag. I fished them out, careful not to rustle the plastic. One fragment, about the size of a postage stamp, showed the words Bill of Sale in bold type and part of a hull identification number, C22. I knew that number. The Chris Craft's HIN was CC22-1956C, a custom number from its Coast Guard documentation. Another fragment had $95000 and the name Christina M. in a font that looked like a purchase agreement. My stomach dropped like an elevator with a snapped cable. They had already sold my boat, or were in the final stages of selling it, using a forged document with my signature. The pieces clicked together. The loan they were trying to get me to sign was probably a separate debt they needed to cover, and the boat sale was the real prize because cash from a sale is harder to trace than loan proceeds tied to a bank. I needed to get inside that office, and I needed to find the original documents. The opportunity presented itself a week later when a pipe burst in the guest suite bathroom. It was a cold snap in late October, and a cheap compression fitting under the sink had cracked. Water sprayed across the tile in a high-pressure fan, and Diane came running, her voice shrill. "Oh my God, what do we do? Mark, call the plumber." Mark arrived with a towel and a look of utter helplessness. He fumbled with his phone, but the first plumber he called couldn't come until the next day. I, meanwhile, had already knelt down and located the shut-off valve under the sink, a small chrome lever I turned clockwise with a firm twist, a motion I'd performed 1,000 times on oxygen lines and Roman 4 pumps. The water stopped instantly. I asked Mark for an adjustable wrench. He looked at me like I'd asked for a lunar module. He eventually found one in the garage, buried under a pile of golf clubs. I used it to loosen the compression nut, removed the cracked fitting, and walked to the hardware store half a mile away to buy a replacement gasket and some plumber's tape. I had the pipe repaired and tested within an hour, a skill I'd picked up from 20 years of living in an old house with Jack, who could rebuild an engine but hated plumbing. As I worked, I watched their eyes. They saw a competent woman emerging from the fog, and it rattled them. That evening, I heard Diane whisper to Mark in the kitchen, her voice low and urgent. "She's snapping out of it. We need to get this done fast before she starts asking questions about the boat. I don't care what you have to do, get her to sign by Friday." I was standing in the hallway just out of sight, and I felt a cold, calm resolve settle over me. I wasn't going to wait for Friday. The next Thursday they announced they were attending a charity gala at the yacht club, a black tie event that would keep them out until at least midnight. "We'll lock up. You rest, sweetie," Diane said, her voice dripping with that false care I'd come to recognize as her tell. She was wearing a navy gown and a string of pearls that looked rented. Mark adjusted his cummerbund in the hallway mirror, checking his reflection from 3 angles. Once their taillights disappeared down the gravel drive, I counted to 100, then unzipped my nursing kit. Inside, beneath the blood pressure cuff, was Jack's lockpick set. I'd practiced on the locks in my own house before packing it, but this was different. This was a live operation with real stakes. The office door had a standard Schlage deadbolt, a 5-pin cylinder with a security pin or 2, nothing fancy. I knelt, inserted a tension wrench into the bottom of the keyway, and applied light clockwise pressure. I used a hook pick to probe the pins. Pin 1 set with a soft click, then pin 3. Pin 2 was stubborn, a spool pin that gave a false set, the plug rotating a fraction before binding. I eased off the tension, felt the counter-rotation, and lifted pin 2 to its true shear line. Pin 4 and 5 set smoothly, and the plug turned. The door swung open with a creak that seemed deafening in the silent house. The office smelled of stale air, printer toner, and a faint trace of Mark's cologne. A metal filing cabinet stood in the corner, 4 drawers, each locked with a subsidiary wafer lock. I had a jiggler pick for this, a flat piece of steel cut with multiple profiles, designed to rock against the wafers until they aligned. I inserted it, jiggled gently for about 20 seconds, and the first drawer slid open with a metallic groan. The top drawer was labeled Personal Legal. Inside, a folder was tabbed Marine Sale, Christina M. I pulled it out and laid it on the desk. The first document was a bill of sale, dated 2 weeks after Jack's funeral, conveying the 1956 Chris-Craft Capri, Hull ID CC 22-1956C, to a buyer in Fort Lauderdale named Gerald Oakes, for a sale price of $95,000. The seller's signature was a clumsy forgery of my name, the loops of the C too round, the pressure inconsistent, as if someone had traced it slowly from another document. The notary stamp below it was from a notary public named Elena Voss, commission number FL 773,421, with an expiration date of March 2023. I knew from a late-night internet search I'd conducted on my phone the week before that Elena Voss had died in a car accident in 2019. Her commission had lapsed and been revoked. The stamp on this document was a fake, a reproduction of a seal that no longer existed. There were also loan documents from Florida Marine Credit Union for $150,000, secured by the same boat, with my forged signature as guarantor, and a UCC-1 financing statement filed with the state that listed the Chris-Craft as collateral. The loan had been funded on October 5th, the proceeds wired to an account in the name of Coldwell Marine Restoration LLC, and the first payment was already 30 days late. The phone call Mark had taken, the frantic one about an extension, was likely about this loan. I photographed every page with my phone, careful to capture the notary stamp, the signatures, the corporate seal on the loan agreement, and the routing numbers on the wire transfer confirmation. I also found a folder labeled Claire, Incompetence Documentation, containing notes in Diane's handwriting describing my confusion, memory lapses, and emotional instability. A paper trail she was building to support a future competency hearing if I resisted. That discovery made my blood run cold. She wasn't just stealing from me, she was preparing to have me declared unfit so she could take everything without my consent. I photographed that too, then replaced every document exactly as I'd found it, aligning the tabs, wiping the surfaces with a tissue from my pocket to remove any fingerprints, though I wasn't sure it mattered. My hands were steady, my pulse slow. I had trained for high-stakes procedures in the ICU, where a single mistake could kill someone. This was just a different kind of surgery. I needed to understand what Jack's key unlocked, and I needed to do it before Diane and Mark escalated. The next morning, while Diane was at her tennis lesson and Mark was showing a waterfront listing, I drove to First Marine Bank on Bay Street. It was a low brick building with a brass anchor by the door, the kind of institution where the tellers know your name and the safe deposit vault smells of old paper and brass polish. I walked to the safe deposit department, presented the key and my driver's license, and signed the access log. A young woman in a navy blazer led me through the vault door, past rows of brass-faced boxes, and pulled box 187 with a second key she carried. She set it on a table in a small, fluorescent-lit room and left me alone. I opened the box. Inside was a thick manila envelope with my name on it in Jack's handwriting. I slid out the contents. There was a letter, a USB flash drive, and a stack of legal documents on heavy bond paper. The letter began, "My dearest Claire, if you're here it means I didn't make it. I've known for a while that something wasn't right. The headaches, the dizziness, I thought it was just stress, but I got a scan last year and the doctor saw a small aneurysm. They said it might never rupture, but I couldn't take the chance of leaving you unprotected. So I put a plan in place. Diane has been circling us for years, asking about the boat, hinting that you'd never be able to manage if something happened. I knew she'd try to take everything the moment I was gone, so I did something she'd never expect. I weaponized the bureaucracy." He explained that, 6 months earlier, suspecting her financial scheming, he had transferred the Chris Crafts title into an irrevocable trust named the Capri Trust. The trust's terms were, in his words, "A knot only we can untie." Any transfer of ownership or any lien against the vessel required not only my physical signature, notarized in person, but also a specific verbal passphrase, spoken by me, and the presence of a designated trust officer from this bank. Without all three conditions met simultaneously, the transfer is legally void, and any attempt to circumvent it triggers a mandatory review by the bank's compliance department and the Coast Guard. He had filed a UCC-1 financing statement with the National Vessel Documentation Center, establishing a priority lien held by the trust, which makes it a matter of federal record. No legitimate lender can take the boat as collateral without conducting a title search that would reveal that lien. The fact that Florida Marine Credit Union had funded a loan against the boat meant they either hadn't searched or someone had falsified the title report. Jack also included a recorded video on the flash drive, a statement of his intentions and a detailed explanation of the trust's mechanisms, his voice calm and deliberate, his face tired but his eyes fierce. "Use this not just to clear your name, but to make sure Diane never does this to anyone else. I've arranged for a friend, a compliance officer at this bank named Victor Reyes, to assist you. He's been alerted to expect your call within a year of my death. He has no loyalty to Diane. I love you, fair winds and following seas." I sat there for what felt like an hour, tears staining the letter, until the overhead light buzzed and I remembered where I was. Then I folded the trust documents into my purse, pocketed the flash drive, and called Mr. Reyes from the bank's lobby. Victor Reyes was a short, precise man in his late 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and the demeanor of a forensic accountant who had seen every flavor of human greed and catalogued them all by statute number. He met me at a coffee shop 3 towns over, far from the lake and the cottage, and listened without interruption as I laid out everything: the forged bill of sale, the fraudulent loan, the fake notary stamp, the recordings I'd already made on my phone of Diane pressuring me, the notes she'd compiled about my supposed incompetence. I showed him the photos on my phone, the trust documents, the video on the flash drive. He studied each piece, his face impassive. When he spoke, his voice was dry and unhurried. "This is textbook bank fraud and wire fraud because the loan proceeds were transmitted across state lines. It's also identity theft and conspiracy. The FBI's white-collar crime division in the district field office will take it, especially given the amount and the interstate sale. But they'll need the original forged documents. Photocopies are good for obtaining a warrant, but in court the originals are what a jury can hold in their hands. And we need a clean, consensual recording of Diane explicitly asking you to sign something fraudulent or demanding an action that would trigger the trust illegally. If we can catch her on tape, in front of a cooperative witness, the case is airtight. Can you get the originals?" I told him about the fire safe in Diane's closet, the model I'd seen once when her closet door was open, a Honeywell unit with a tubular lock. I'd bought a similar lock online and practiced until I could open it in under 2 minutes. Ray's nodded, a faint glint of approval in his eyes. Good, get them. Then we'll set up a controlled meeting at the bank. I'll coordinate with the FBI. You'll wear a wire. The notary you mentioned, the fake one, will have a real notary there as a witness, and the agents will be waiting in an adjacent room. This will only work if they feel confident, if they believe they're about to win. That weekend, Diane and Mark left for a day-long wine tasting in the Shenandoah Valley, an event that would keep them away from 8 in the morning until well past dinner. I had the house to myself. I slipped into the master suite, a room I'd only glimpsed from the hallway, all white linens and tasteful abstract art. The closet was a walk-in, a canyon of designer clothes and shoe racks. Behind a stack of Diane's summer wedges, I found the fire safe, a squat grey box with a tubular keyhole on the front. I knelt, pulled out the tubular pick I'd purchased online, a specialty tool with a circular arrangement of pins that you tension and then press one by one until they set, and I went to work. The lock was a 7-pin design, common for these safes. I inserted the tensioning post into the center, applied light torque, and used a feeler pick to depress each pin, feeling for the slight give of a binding wafer. Pin 3 first, then pin 7, then the rest in sequence. On my third pass, the plug rotated a full quarter turn. The safe clicked open. Inside were birth certificates, a jewelry box, a stack of $100 bills, and a thick folder labeled boat transfer. I pulled it out and spread the contents on the carpet. There was the original bill of sale with the forged signature, in blue ink on heavy paper, the notary block stamped with a seal that would fail any forensic examination. There was the original loan contract from Florida Marine Credit Union, 17 pages of small print, with my forged signature on the last page, dated and witnessed by the same fraudulent notary. There was a notary journal that Diane had apparently kept herself, a bound book of entries supposedly recording the notarizations, filled out in her own handwriting, with thumbprint pads left conspicuously blank. And there was a letter from the buyer in Fort Lauderdale, Gerald Oakes, confirming the wire transfer of $95,000 and instructing the delivery of the boat to a marina in Lauderdale. I photographed everything again, then replaced the originals with identical photocopies I'd made at a FedEx office the day before, a trick I'd learned in nursing when switching out medications from a locked cabinet, but leaving the patient's record intact. If she checked the folder quickly, she'd see the copies and not realize the originals were gone. I relocked the safe, reset the shoes, and was back in my room before noon. That evening, I delivered the originals to Victor Ray's at a Denny's parking lot off the interstate. He called the FBI, and the stage was set for a final confrontation. The FBI needed a few days to coordinate, so I continued the charade, but I also wanted to test something. I wanted to know if Diane had a single shred of humanity left, or if I could proceed with what was coming without any guilt. On a Thursday afternoon, with just the two of us in the kitchen and Mark out showing a property, I executed a small, cruel experiment. I had been standing at the island, holding a cup of chamomile tea, when I let my knees buckle. I had rehearsed this in my room, timing the collapse to land on the tile with enough force to be convincing but not enough to injure myself. I went down hard, one hand clutching my chest, the other flailing and knocking over a stool. I gasped for air, my face contorted, my training as a nurse allowing me to simulate the shallow, rapid breathing and fixed gaze of a cardiac event. I wheezed, "Diane, help, my chest, can't breathe." She was at the table, scrolling through her phone, and she looked up. Her eyes, clear and calculating, went first not to my face but to the counter where a document sat, the settlement agreement she'd been trying to get me to sign all week. She stood, stepped over my outstretched leg as if it were a piece of furniture, and grabbed the paper. She folded it and tucked it into the pocket of her cardigan. Only then did she kneel down, her voice thin and unconvincing. "Claire, what's wrong? Should I call 911? I let the act continue for another 10 seconds, then sucked in a big breath, coughed, and sat up slowly, rubbing my chest. A dizzy spell. I think my blood sugar crashed. "I'm sorry." She helped me to a chair, brought me a glass of orange juice, and fussed over me for a moment. But I had seen the truth in that split second when she'd stepped over my body. She would have let me die on that cold tile floor if it meant getting a signature. Any residual family loyalty, any hope that Jack's love for his sister meant something, evaporated in that kitchen like alcohol off a hot surface. 2 days later, Diane announced we were going to the bank. "Everything's finally ready, sweetie. Victor Ray's, you remember him, the trust officer Jack appointed. He's arranged a meeting so we can settle the estate. Just one signature and a quick confirmation of the trust's passphrase and you're free of all this mess. We'll have the boat back in your name, the loan paid off, everything tidy." She sounded almost giddy, like a child before a birthday party. I dressed carefully that morning, a loose blouse and a cardigan. The night before, a female FBI agent named Chen had come to the cottage while Diane and Mark were at dinner, and she had taped a tiny transmitter to my ribcage, just below my left breast, where the curve of my body would hide the bulge. The wire was a state-of-the-art device, a flat disc the size of a quarter, with a battery that would last 12 hours. She tested it by having me read a paragraph from a magazine while she listened in a van parked down the street, her voice coming back through an earpiece she gave me. Good to go. The transmitter would feed directly to a recording device monitored by the FBI tactical team that would be positioned at the bank. As we drove to the bank in Mark's Lexus, Diane chattered about the buyers in Fort Lauderdale, how they'd fallen in love with the boat, how the restoration shop was going to be a great investment, how I'd be taken care of for the rest of my life. I sat silently in the passenger seat, my purse in my lap, feeling the cool metal of the transmitter against my skin. I looked out the window at the bare trees and the grey November sky, and I thought of Jack, of his careful, quiet plan, and I felt him with me in that car. At the bank, the conference room was panelled in dark wood, with a long mahogany table and a view of the parking lot. A woman with a notary seal was seated at the head of the table, a young woman in a black blazer who looked nervous. Victor Reyes stood in the corner, pretending to be a bank manager, a stack of trust documents in his hands. The air conditioning hummed. Mark pulled out a stack of documents from his folio, maybe 20 pages. He spread them on the table in front of me. The settlement agreement was cunningly worded. It stated that I, Claire, acknowledged the full $150,000 debt as my sole liability, released all claims to the Chris Craft, and agreed to a payment plan with Florida Marine Credit Union. There was also a separate release stating I had voluntarily sold the boat to Gerald Oakes for $95,000, and I waived any right to contest the sale. Diane slid a pen across the table toward me, the same pen she'd offered me a dozen times before. Just sign here, sweetie, and to make everything official with the trust you need to say the passphrase aloud. Jack told me about it, something about the water, sweet water, fair wind, or maybe fair winds and following seas. Just say it and we're done. She'd been trying to extract that passphrase for weeks, thinking it would unlock the trust in her favor. She had no idea that the trust required my genuine, uncoerced consent, and that the phrase was a different one entirely, a phrase only Jack and I shared, a line from a poem he'd quoted on our wedding day. I looked at the notary, her hand poised over her stamp. I looked at Mark, his jaw tight. I looked at Diane, her eyes bright with a hunger that was almost obscene. Then I spoke clearly for the recording, every word deliberate. I'm not signing anything, and the passphrase isn't sweet water, it's the truth floats. But I won't say it because that would trigger a transaction I don't consent to. What I will do is tell you that I know about the forged bill of sale, the fraudulent loan, the fake notary stamp with Elena Voss's dead woman's commission number. I have the originals. The FBI has them too. You didn't just steal from me, Diane. You committed wire fraud across state lines, bank fraud against a federally insured institution, and identity theft. Every word you've said to me in the past month has been recorded, including your little performance in the kitchen when you stepped over my body to grab a document. You are done. The room froze. Diane's smile shattered like a dropped glass, her face cycling through confusion, rage, and then a cold, feral denial. She lunged for the documents on the table, but Mark grabbed her arm, his own face ashen. The notary looked alarmed, her chair scraping back. At that moment, the conference room door opened. 2 FBI agents in dark suits entered, followed by a uniformed police officer and the female agent, Chen, who had wired me. The lead agent, a woman with a sharp grey barb and a voice like a steel blade, announced, "Diane Caldwell and Mark Caldwell, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, bank fraud, forgery, and aggravated identity theft." She read Miranda rights while Diane screamed at me, her voice rising to a shriek. "You planned this, you snake. Jack would hate you for this." Mark just stared at his hands, all the polished veneer stripped away to reveal a small, frightened man who had bet on the wrong horse. They were cuffed and led out, Diane's heels clicking a desperate, irregular rhythm on the marble floor of the bank lobby, her shouts echoing until the heavy doors swung shut. Victor Reyes handed me the trust documents, his hand steady. "It's done," he said. "The boat's title is clean, the trust is intact, and the U.S. Attorney's Office will be in touch. You should go home, get some rest." I walked out of that bank into the thin winter sunlight, and for the first time since Jack died, I took a breath that went all the way to the bottom of my lungs. The legal wheels turned with a satisfying, if grinding, precision. The federal case was strong, a prosecutor's dream. The forged documents, the bank records showing the wire transfers, the testimony of the fake notary, who had been coerced and who cooperated in exchange for immunity from prosecution, and the hours of recorded conversations I'd gathered on my phone and through the FBI wire all stacked up like cordwood. Diane, facing a potential 20 years, pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. She was sentenced to 63 months in federal prison at Alderson, West Virginia, and ordered to pay restitution of $150,000 to the bank and $95,000 to me, though I knew I'd never see a dime of it. Mark, who had handled the logistics, the real estate shell games, and the falsified title report sent to the lender, got 48 months plus 5 years of supervised release, and his real estate license was revoked permanently. The boat was recovered in Fort Lauderdale, sitting in dry storage at a marina, the sale voided by the trust's priority lien. The bank that had issued the fraudulent loan, Florida Marine Credit Union, was found negligent for not conducting a proper Coast Guard documentation search, which would have revealed the trust's UCC-1 filing. Their errors and omissions insurance had to cover the debt, and they paid a fine to the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. The $95,000 Diane had received from Gerald Oakes, the buyer, was seized from an account she'd hidden under a shell company and returned to Oakes, who sued her separately for the hassle and won a default judgment of $50,000. But the biggest victory, the one that tasted sweetest, came in civil court. My attorney, a sharp woman named Kate Navarro who specialized in fraud recovery, filed a civil suit for intentional fraud, conversion, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The judgment came back at $220,000, covering not just the monetary damages but punitive damages designed to punish Diane's malice. Collecting it, however, was another matter. Diane and Mark's assets were liquidated, the Lexus was repossessed, their investment accounts were drained, and Mark's brokerage commissions were garnished. But everything of real value was either in his mother's name or encumbered by second mortgages and lines of credit that had been maxed out to sustain their lifestyle during the months they'd been scheming. Except for one thing, the lakefront cottage. Mark had bought it before the marriage, but they had used it as collateral for a home equity line of credit that was now in default because they couldn't make the payments from prison. The bank foreclosed, and the property went to a sheriff's auction on a grey Tuesday in February. I attended with a cashier's check in my purse, funded by a small inheritance from Jack's life insurance policy, a policy Diane hadn't managed to touch because it named me as the sole beneficiary. The auction was held on the courthouse steps, a cold wind whipping off the lake. A few investors bid, but when I raised my paddle for the winning bid, $185,000, far below market value because of the stigma of the foreclosure, the auctioneer banged his gavel and the deed was mine. I stood on those steps, the paper heavy in my hand, and I thought of the guest suite with the deadbolt, the shredder in the office, the kitchen tile where I'd faked my collapse. I thought of Diane, sitting in a cell in West Virginia, and I allowed myself a small, private smile. I fixed the cottage. The boathouse got a new paint job, the rotting dark planks were replaced with composite lumber, and the fireplace saw its first real fire. The Chris-Craft, my beautiful Christina M, was restored again, this time by a yard I trusted, the hull sanded and varnished to a mirror shine, the chrome polished, the engine tuned. I hired a retired Coast Guard captain named Gus to teach me the commercial licensing, and I launched a small business, Sunset Cruises on the Lake. I called it Truth Floats Charters. The boat's name was now emblazoned on a massive canvas banner that hung from the dark stern pole, visible from the water 100 yards away. The Truth Floats. Every evening from May through September, I'd take couples and families out onto the lake, the water turning to gold and rose in the dying light, and I'd tell them the story. I'd point to the cottage and say, "That used to belong to the woman who tried to steal this boat from me. She forged my signature, sold it to a man in Florida, and left me with $150,000 in debt she took out in my name. Now I use her dark to launch my tours." Irony has a lovely sense of timing. The business grew, and the cottage, once a cage, became my sanctuary. I planted a garden where Diane's decorative gravel had been, and I hung Jack's old tools on the boathouse wall. Sometimes, when the lake is flat and the sky is that particular shade of lavender that only happens after a good sunset, I feel him with me, his hand on the wheel, his voice in the wind. Now, when I look at the water, I see not a grave but a path forward. I learned that vulnerability isn't weakness. It's a strategy, a mask you wear while you gather the evidence that will burn your enemies to the ground. I learned that the quietest revenge is often the most complete, the kind that doesn't scream but simply arrives, a lien filed in a federal database, a trust that can't be broken, a key in a box that nobody thought to open. And I learned that true love, the kind Jack had for me, can stretch beyond the grave like a lifeline thrown into a storm, a knot tied so tight that no thief can ever pick it loose. So, have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? I'd love to read your experiences in the comments. If you believe that justice is a patient hunter, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories where the underdog turns the tables. Make sure you ring the bell because you don't want to miss what surfaces next. Until then, keep your documents safe, your anchors heavy, and your truth afloat.